Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 2023 Black New England Conference. My name is Jerry Ann Bogus, and I'm the Executive Director for the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire.
And I am Cabria Baumgartner. I'm the Dean's Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies here at Northeastern, and I am happy to welcome you all to the 17th Annual Black New England Conference.
It is so interesting to be here. We have come a long way from our early beginnings in Durham, New Hampshire, to Boston, and to this new partnership with Northeastern. We're really excited about it. This is such an amazing opportunity for our little but mighty organization. And if you're in New Hampshire, you know just how tiny we are and just the depth and breadth of our work. We have explored topics from the politics of race to humor, satire, and Black consciousness to today's topic of the arts in our BIPOC communities. We hope throughout the next 2 days, we will learn together, expand our horizons, and build stronger and more meaningful communities.
Just a note, we're delighted that there is a videographer here, Kelsey, who will be capturing participant interactions for the conference for educational purposes.
Before we start and before I introduce our next podium representative, I just wanted to welcome the folks who are joining us virtually. We wanted to share some information to them. We have posted a link in the chat so you can go to the conference program to follow along with all the panels and video presentations that will occur over the next 2 days. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of each panel. If you have any questions during presentation, please use the chat feature and start your message with the word question. Conference staff will collect these questions and then we'll read them out. If you have a technical issue, start your message with IT and somebody will get back to you.
All right. It is now my honor to thank Elizabeth Hudson, Dean of the College of Arts, Media, and Design here at Northeastern University, for her support of the conference and to ask her to say a few words of welcome.
Hello, everybody, and hello to people who are here virtually. So yes, I'm Dean of the College of Arts, Media, and Design at Northeastern, which seems particularly apropos for this conference. It's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Northeastern. It is such a privilege for us to host the 17th Annual Black New England Conference to Northeastern this year to celebrate the experiences and artistry of Black, Indigenous, and people of color as an under-recognized yet powerful cultural force in New England and beyond. At this university, we are proud to focus on experiential learning, on partnerships and impact. And as the Dean of the College of Arts, Media, and Design, I am keenly aware of how crucial creative fields are to the very creation of culture and its impact. Our fields are often central to defining our identities and our communities, our very place in the world. As I welcome you to a 2-day gathering where community members, artists, students, activists, and faculty and staff will think together about how the arts are central to celebrating the Black experience and the experiences of BIPOC communities, I can't help but reflect for a moment on my own journey. Having worked as an academic in creating a place for the African diaspora musical experience in the curriculum at the University of Virginia, where I was for many years, talking and teaching about American histories of appropriation of African American artistic expression, I was humbled in living and working in New Zealand to be confronted with my own blind spots. There, I learned the type of academic work we often take for granted is unacceptable, because there, The ownership of Indigenous artistic traditions is enshrined in law and may not be taken over without consent and participation. Thus, I began to learn how in universities we cannot be so arrogant as to take on this cultural work on our own. We can only honor these values through the kind of partnership that this conference represents, in the exchange of practices and ideas about how BIPOC creators talk about their own communities and talk with other communities of color in the spirit of empowering and honoring artistic and cultural legacies, learning and engaging creatively. I hope the panels, presentations, and performances you'll take in today and tomorrow will inspire thoughtful conversations and foster new ideas in your own fields as, in the Northeastern spirit of interdisciplinary collaboration, we cross boundaries between playwriting, music, storytelling, poetry, performance, and more. So again, it's an honor to host the wonderful cultural exchange that's about to take place, but it's even more exciting to see where the conversation might take us, how it might shape curriculum and policy and community building, and eventually people's everyday experience of the key issues being discussed. Please enjoy your time on campus. I'm so sorry that my schedule doesn't allow me to join you. I would love it. I looked at the conference. It looks fantastic. But on behalf of Northeastern University leadership, thank you so much for bringing this important work here. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Dean Hudson, for your warm welcome. For those who are new to the conference, welcome. And for our returning attendees, we are so grateful for your continued support. And we're excited to kick off this event, so let's get started.
Thank you. It gives me great pleasure to now open the conference. This is our first panel, our first presentation, our first performance for the day. It'll be Generation Rising, Recovering Language and Culture, a presentation by Native American storyteller Silvermoon LaRose, with host Dr. Dottie Morris. Dr. Dottie Morris is the Associate Vice President for Institutional Equity and Diversity, and she's a member of the College President's Cabinet at Keene State College. Dottie?
Just a minute. I don't know about you, but I am excited. I look forward to this conference every year. It feels more like a revival meeting, an opportunity. Yes, it's a revival meeting in so many ways. It's where we can come and collectively exhale after weeks of having ourselves not breathe. It's an opportunity for us to catch our breath and be in the beloved community. I am so excited to moderate this first panel called Generations Rising, Recovering Language and Culture. A culture that's deeply rooted in the oral tradition of passing the sacred knowledge of that culture from one generation to the next generations could be destroyed when there's an attempt to purge the people of that language. It is not surprising that the colonizers and others who seek to oppress cut off communication between people by criminalizing speaking of their language. Language represents more than words. Language helps us convey the rhythm of the people. It helps us to embolden and share our souls. And it allows for the treasures within the psyche of the people to come alive in the physical world. The loss of that language and the inability to transmit sacred knowledge means the severing of ties of who you are by knowing who your people are. Most of us have heard of genocide, but ethnocide is a systematic process of destroying culture and everything that relates to that culture. We often understate the importance of remaining connected to one's culture in the same way that we talk about the physical way of remaining alive. But that keeps us alive, being connected to culture. We know through genocide there is a physical death or an ongoing threat of that physical death. Ethnocide creates the conditions where that death is associated with spiritual, psychological, and emotional well-being of the people. The death is related to internalized oppression and other forms of self-degrading behaviors and belief systems. So we must find a way to rediscover one's language, because that language is a form of resistance, and it's an inoculation against the desire to redefine who you are by replacing the memories of those who oppress you by the language that they use. In other words, we must find the language to define ourselves, tell stories, and express our truths, and most of all, transmit these stories and truths to our children. The attempt to take away language and other forms of expression was the means to try to silence a people, and yet the recovery of language and culture persists through the connection between the ancestors and the descendants. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Silvermoon LaRose, who is actively engaged in the preservation of language and culture. In order for us to be consistent with the value of having people speak for themselves and tell you who they are, I am not going to read her bio. Through her stories and discussions about the truths, and her truths most of all, she will speak for herself and tell you who she is. So open your hearts and minds to the words of Silvermoon LaRose.
Oh, all right. Thank you, I appreciate it. Because I made these slides so you could look at them. A very pregnant woman reclined against a tree, resting the weight of her womb on the trunk, and as she leaned back, the pressure of her body uprooted that tree, and a great hole formed in the sky. She leaned over the hole, staring in curiosity at an orb of water below. And in looking forward, she lost her balance and fell from the sky world. The beings of the air and water came together to offer her a resting place. The crane caught her in his mighty wings. Muskrat dove to the bottoms of the waters, and grasping the soil in his small hands, he floated back to the surface. Turtle offered her back to carry the earth, and thus the earth was formed, carried on the back of a turtle, and Sky Woman was laid gently to rest upon the land. And it was there that she gave birth to her 2 children. And to nourish them always upon the land, she gave her body to the earth. Her frame became the mountains and the valleys, her blood the rivers and pools, her hair the sweet grass. From her anatomy, all manner of things grew to nourish her children. Creator, looking down from Skyworld, he wept for the loss of his daughter, his great tears salting the ocean waters. He knew his grandchildren would need community to help them survive in this new world. And so from the places where the water and the land meet, he scraped together clumps of moist clay, and he tempered it with shell and with bits of plant fibers, and mixing and molding them together, he fashioned humans. They were formed of the earth and the waters that had once been his daughter, and so she too would become the mother of these children. Creator then built a great fire, and he left the clay beings to rest while the coals of the fire grew hotter and hotter. And while he was away, Coyote happened upon this place, and he saw the clay beings resting in the sun. Curiosity got the better of him, and he threw the clay people into the fire and watched them bake and harden. His intent was to let them cook and await Creator's return, but in his excitement, he grew impatient, and he drew the beings from the fire, thinking he could observe them more closely. But when he set them on the land, they scattered away in all directions, breaking into smaller groups, moving far across the lands. Frightened of what he had done, Coyote ran. And when Creator returned, he found the fire empty. The people had spread across the earth. They had adjusted to their chosen lands and creating lifeways and traditions, beliefs and ceremony, language and stories, all of them unique, all of them beautiful, all of them connected to their Okasaki, their Earth Mother. Asquikwasanumas, Natasui Silvermoon LaRose, Ni Nahahagansic, Kanayantic, Kanupi Amni Tampawaga Aki up Massachusetts. Welcome all to the lands of the Massachusetts. My name is Silvermoon LaRose. I'm a member of the Narragansett tribe. In our language, Narragansett means people of the small point, and it's talking about those points of land that meet the water, the place where Creator grabbed that clay to form humanity. So when we introduce ourselves as Indigenous people and we tell you where we're from, we speak of being of the land of a certain place, because that land is what we're made up of. That's what language does. It connects us to place, it connects us to those stories. It helps us to understand ourselves. And our history, such as it is one of conquest and colonization here in the United States. And there has been a mass loss of Indigenous languages since the time of conquest and colonization. And that's the result of a number of different things. We can look at Christianity as a part of that. Now, I myself come from a family of ministers, Native ministers that preached at the Narragansett Indian Church going all the way back to Samuel Niles in the 1750s, the first minister of that church. But there was an understanding that this language that was brought by Europeans was meant to teach us a new way of believing so that they could control, so that they could impress upon us an allegiance to their government by weakening our belief systems and our connection to this place. They even created laws, and there are numerous laws. One, I can't go into all of them, but one of note in 1638, the Treaty of Hartford, which outlawed Pequot language. It seized tribal lands. It disbanded those survivors. It enslaved those people. And there's a trauma as a result of conquest and colonization, a trauma that's been an ongoing history of conquest and colonization. From slavery to the indentured servitude of Indigenous people, between the years of 1492 and 1880, it's estimated that up to 5.5 Indigenous people were enslaved in the Americas. So we have a story of being enslaved as well. And what happens when people own you? They change you into believing how they believe, in speaking how they speak, in living how they live, and this is part of the assimilation practice. And it was furthered through efforts aimed at our children. Now here on the East Coast, we have faced slavery and indentured servitude for many generations. Even children as young as a year old, what are they doing? But they were taken from their families and enslaved to non-native families who would then bring them up, not connected to their lands and their community and their people, but within a new community and taught a new way to live. This continued throughout the late 1800s into the 1900s through the boarding school. The boarding schools were put in place to kill the Indian and save the man, to divorce children from an understanding of who they were, their connection to this place, and the language of their ancestors, and all of the stories and beliefs and values that would have been passed on to them through that language. And as the boarding schools lost support, they changed focus. And then it became the foster care system that removed our children from our homes. 1 in 4 Native children being removed from their families and placed with non-Native families. Even when there were other families able to take them from their own communities, even when their cases didn't warrant them being taken at all. And this went on so significantly that laws had to be put in place to protect children from being removed from their tribal communities, the Indian Child Welfare Act. Land dispossession was a means of divorcing us from our language, taking our place of being, where we were created, where we had formed connections, where we had community, and then displacing us to all areas. We have community members in the Azores and the West Indies, sold from these lands and taken to other places. We have community members that, leaving the violence of this space, moved westward as far as Wisconsin. We have communities in Brothertown. We have Indigenous people who have been displaced to all areas of the world because of conquest and colonization. And that's a loss of community. And why community is so very valuable in language preservation is you need that network effect. You need other people to speak to in order to continue language. If you don't have anyone to talk to, you lose your memory of words and phrases and communication. I have a mother-in-law who's a fluent Ute speaker, and she's finding it hard to recall words that she grew up with because she does not have enough community to share language with. And there have been efforts to preserve Indigenous language by non-Native people, but they had different reasons for preserving this language. Originally, the early collection of language was focused around conversion to Christianity. The first published works that were produced to preserve Indigenous languages of the New England region were all to recreate Bibles, to have a way to speak to Indigenous people about their understanding of God and the world and how we should live and how we should be and how we should interact. So conversion was the goal. And conversion was important for gaining allegiance to a new way of living. So language became a means of conversation around trade and treaty with tribal communities to dispossess us of our land. And later there was an interest in language from an anthropological standpoint, a means of taking from our communities, our culture, our lifeways, our belief systems, and reinterpreting them in their own way, as opposed to us interpreting them for you. We'll take your language and we'll tell you what you mean by it. And now we're seeing language for profit. There are groups like the Language Conservancy whose goals and efforts say they're about saving dying languages, and yet we see an appropriation of language. The Lakota community has outlawed this group from being on their lands. They have since been banned from their lands. After doing a project around language reclamation and building all of these resources to be able to share with the community, to reintroduce Lakota language and have more fluent speakers within their community. And all of that knowledge was taken, was put together into packets and books and exercises and lessons, and then sold back to the community. And when tribal members tried to gain use of those materials that were produced by their own mothers and grandmothers and grandfathers and aunties and uncles, and share those, they were hit with legal action against the use of those things that now they had signed over belonging to this community group. And this has happened in other communities as well. Projects have ended as a result. And as Jane Anderson, an associate professor of anthropology, said, not only do tribes rarely share in the profits of language preservation efforts, they often have to pay part of the costs to implement them and have to purchase the end product. Imagine having to buy back your language. So there are laws in effect to protect Indigenous languages. A Congressional Act of October 30th, 1990 put into place the Native American Languages Act. And this was to protect and ensure the survival of Indigenous languages. But they didn't put any money behind that. There was little effort to actually put that into practice, what was put on paper. And this is what forced movement towards making those words mean something. And in January of 2023, President Biden signed the Durban-Feeling Native American Languages Act to review the federal agency's compliance with the Native American Language Act. Imagine having to create an act to make sure you're doing what you said you were going to do in the first act. But we'll take it. We'll see what comes of that. Because according to Indigenous Language Institute, prior to European contact, there were at least over 300 Indigenous languages spoken in the United States prior to colonization. It was probably many more than that, but that is what they have recorded record of. And today, of those, only about 175 remain as fluently spoken languages. And it's estimated that without restoration efforts, there will only be around 20 Indigenous languages left by 2050. That's a huge loss, because as our elders pass on, they carry their language with them. And when they go, there's so much that we lose as a result, because there's words in language that there's no understanding of in the English language. There's knowledge that can be gained from breaking down the meaning of a word that connects you to all of the history and culture, spirituality behind those belongings of our plant relatives, our animal relatives, our cultural practices that we don't have words for in the English language. But there's hope. Dr. Ella Sekatow, tribal elder who has since passed on from us, she said, as long as one person is still speaking one word, we have not lost our language. I never want any Indigenous person to feel that they are lacking in some way because they're not able to speak their traditional language. It's not our fault, the history of language dispossession. So take hope and the fact that as long as you're trying, your ancestors are listening to you. And so we are in a period of recovery and continuance and celebration around Indigenous languages. In my own tribal community, we have efforts in place to reintroduce language. At the Tomaquag Museum, one of our young educators, Lindsay Montanari, of the Narragansett tribal community, she has Language with Lindsay on YouTube. You can go and learn words and phrases and how to introduce them into your homes. We have a community group that has a Facebook page where they share resources and videos speaking our Narragansett language. We took the colonial publication, A Key into the Language of America, written by Roger Williams, about our culture and our community and our language. And the Tomaquag Museum made its own version of it to then be able to speak to his interpretations and what may or may not have been correct, and to take back ownership of that identity through language. We have language classes with our community. We have an elders council that does the work of coming together in agreement around what forms of language we will use and pass on, what resources are best, because you have all these non-native resources out there to utilize, and so we look at, well, what's our community using? And what do we say for ourselves? And so there's a reclamation of language within the community, creating new songs, creating new games, to bring language back in any way that we can. The Wampanoag community have taken it a step further. And under the leadership of Jessie Little-Doe Baird, they have pieced together their language to bring it back into a fluently spoken language. And there was a lot of scholarship done to do that. And we know that it's not exactly how it would have been prior to European contact, but they utilized the resources and the language families within the Algonquin community to put that language back together as best as they could. And now it's fluently spoken again. And this is a collaborative effort of all of the different bands of the Wampanoag community, and it's their mission to return language fluency to the Wampanoag Nation. And they have a language reclamation school where children are being brought up to be fluent speakers. And so it shows what's possible when a community takes back ownership of their language. We see a healing, we see an empowerment, we see a reconnection with things that were taken at one point. Reclaiming our language is one means of repairing the broken circle of cultural loss and pain. To be able to understand and speak our language means to see the world as our families did for centuries. This is but one path which keeps us connected to our people, the earth, and the philosophies and truths given to us by the Creator. And not just in spoken word, but also in written as well. Communities are forming their own language, their own written language, so that they have a way of producing materials in their own language, and that's being celebrated in literature. Less than 1% of all published works are written by Indigenous authors, so there is plenty of room for more works to be out there that are expressing so many different genres and perspectives and viewpoints and memories. And the utilization of our traditional language, even in our own characters, into those publications. In our art, representation through art of all manner, from two-dimensional arts to traditional and contemporary arts, art is an expression of language, art is an expression of community. Through music, both traditional music and contemporary works, we're using language to express so many things. Film and television, a new venture for Indigenous people, because for so many generations, non-Native people have told stories about us and made us look a little wild. And now we can tell our own stories in our own ways, taking back ownership of how others perceive us. And even using the internet as a tool. It has opened up a world of communication and exploration, podcasts, social media. There are creators that are doing language programs through the internet so that people can experience language, both native and non. Language is what reconnects us to who we are, to our community, to our ancestors before us, to all of the expressions of our humanity. And we see that in the constant sharing within our communities and outside of our communities, giving our stories to others. But that helps to open up an understanding of our communities, what's important to us, what we're working towards, and how you can engage in those practices with us. When I look at this photo, that's some of my artwork, it's some of my family's artwork, it's my children, my grandmother, it's my aunties, those who taught me storytelling, and those that I hope to give it to. So that picture makes me excited. I didn't have enough room for my collage. And there are many resources. If you're looking to learn more, I'm happy to share those with you as well. And you can always connect with me through the Tomaquag Museum so I can share these with you. Thank you very much. Did I end on time?
I don't think, oh yes, it's on now. So now we would like the audience, because we want this to be a conversation. So if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to We're asking you to speak in the mic so the people who are online can hear you. If you are out there in Zoom land, can you please put questions in the chat box? And be sure to say the word question so people will know. Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I had a question about place names, and how is the state of Rhode Island handling restoring place names, or you know, since the language is giving back the meaning of the places?
So on a federal level, there are efforts to do that. Rhode Island has not jumped on board, but at a federal level, anyone can make a report for a change of name to a place. It goes through a process of being reviewed, and it's kind of exciting to see it happening in other places. It has not happened in Rhode Island, but in other places it has. And not only is it renaming places, but it's also helping people to understand language relationship, how to say those names properly, using the spelling and even characters of the preferred tribal communities in relation to that name, and making others sit in their discomfort around not being able to pronounce things, but learn that they have to get used to that. I think that's important, to respect other languages, to not take the easy way. Well, I'm just going to say this because it's easier, but to actually take the time to learn how to pronounce it. And when we take back place names that are original, you get a lot of information along with that. A lot of the place names that do exist in Rhode Island that are in the Indigenous language, it speaks to what it is the place of. What is the stories behind that place? What was the use and connection to that land prior to European contact? So we can gain a lot of knowledge from that by reintroducing traditional place names. So I think it's an exciting venture, one that has kind of been spearheaded by having an Indigenous woman in that Secretary of the Interior position. Isn't that awesome? Yes, clap. It's hugely exciting to see things actually happening when we get into those spaces. So I'm looking forward to seeing more of that happening. It is a process when you do apply for a change of name to a place, but hopefully it'll be something that gets carried on in further future administrations.
Any other questions? I'll take an opportunity to ask a question. I know that you spoke to the trauma involved in some of the efforts to disconnect people, and by replacing language to describe who you are. Are you willing to speak more to how you see that playing out, even today?
It's always difficult to speak about trauma, especially when you know people's stories that it's happened to. I have relatives on my children's side of the family who were in the boarding schools, who have stories that they've shared with me about their own loss of language. My eldest son's great-grandmother shared her story of being a child, and in her family, where they lived in Oklahoma, where they were placed, there are allotted land. It's not great farming land, but they worked that land anyway. And during the summertime, there was food enough for the family, but in the wintertime, it would get really tough. And so they knew they'd have to send their children to schools. So in her generation, they were not forced to go to the schools, but you kind of were put in a position where what else could you choose? And so the families knew they would have to send them to the schools, and they didn't want their children to be disciplined for using traditional languages. So they only allowed them to speak English within their home, even though her parents spoke fluent Choctaw. And so she grew up hearing language spoken, but never being able to use it herself. And she was sharing as an elder the difficulty in being able to relearn languages and learn to speak them. And we know from human development that some sounds, if you don't learn to make them as a child, you'll never be able to produce. And so it's very difficult to reclaim language later on. And I think the saddest part is that people make it their fault a little bit. Like I'm a failure for not being able to do this, for not having this, for not being able to pass it on to my children and grandchildren. And it's not their fault, but there is some kind of self-hurt that goes on as a result. And so that's what becomes really difficult to combat, to empower people to understand that those losses are not their fault, and that anything that we do to try to bring language back, just to celebrate it, even if you only know a couple of songs, because they would sing in Choctaw hymns in the church, and that was very empowering for them. And I was like, every little bit is so helpful and so healthy. So I think there's a healing that can come from even those small things that celebrate language and reintroduce us. And she would have been proud to know that she now has great-grandchildren who are growing up speaking language, involved in language programs, happily celebrating their language. Their names are in their traditional language. That's exciting to see that despite all of that, there's a reclamation happening. And it's exciting to see what our children are going to do for us, because they're going to be the ones that bring this language back.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, yes. I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
Hi, Silvermoon. So this is a treat for me because earlier this week I was treated to storytelling by Sharente Harris from your community. And I think about you and Sharente and the work you do and how generous you are with your storytelling and how generous you are with your time. And it makes me think about what is the negotiation between making sure that non-Native, non-Narragansett people have a at least basic understanding of your stories and your way of life versus those things being taken and appropriated still. And I often wonder that when I hear both of you speak or when I hear people from Tomaquag speaking in storytelling, because that's still a threat. So what's the negotiation there?
Good question. Sharente is my little cousin. We share my grandmother, his great-grandmother. Our grandparents were the same, which her picture was up in my little...
I saw.
Did you see it? And he was in the picture as well. We come from a storytelling family, and this is how we've learned those stories and learned to pass them on. I think your stories are a legacy handed on to you. And stories don't stay the same forever. Me and Sharente can tell the same stories in completely different ways, because that's the beauty of oral traditions, is that everyone adds a little bit of themselves into it. And it becomes modernized to connect us to who we are now and the experience that we have now that people can relate to in our generations. And there's so much opportunity for the sharing of our stories and a willingness to share our stories, and we're looking for opportunity to do that. As I shared, less than 1% of Indigenous people are published. We want to publish these works. And so for those in non-Native communities who are sitting in positions of power or positions where they could connect and make that happen for our community, there's an opportunity for collaboration in sharing those stories, but allowing us to take the lead on giving them. Even within Native communities, there are authors who have taken stories of other tribal communities and shared them. And that also is a dispossession of those stories. So I think if you have, been one of the lucky few who are in those publishing spaces, you can open the door for other people from other communities to get their stories out there. You can support that, because some people are oral storytellers and it's a little harder to put it on paper, so they could use a hand. There's opportunity for collaboration and partnership in the sharing of stories. And it has happened and happens successfully in good ways. One of my favorite children's books it's called Fatty Legs. And I love that stuff. Have you read
That
it?
sounds like one I
It's
would
a
like.
great one. But it's an Alaskan Native elder's story of her boarding school experience. And it was written by a non-Native woman who shared, who they worked together to share that story, because the elder had the story, she wanted to share the story, but she wasn't a writer. The woman who wrote her story is actually a relative who's married into the family, and so they worked collaboratively to bring that story in a way that represented the storyteller. And they're both able to call themselves published authors as a result. So I think there's opportunity for shared scholarship. And that would be extremely helpful to our community, to be given those opportunities, because that's how you kind of break into the publishing world and create more opportunities for our community members to share stories. So I would say those are the partnerships we're looking for. Those are the connections we're hoping to make. Because for many of those authors who are becoming published, it's been very regional. Canada has done a lot of projects around sharing Indigenous stories, so there is a lot of stories coming out of Indigenous communities in Canada. Scholastics has very specifically targeted the publishing of their stories there. In the United States, it has mostly focused in Western communities, so there's a whole region of the United States that have had very little opportunity to break into those publishing circles. So I think there's opportunity for that. Did that answer your question?
And I'm glad you brought up in your presentation the production of way more images on television and through movies, and as told through the experience of Indigenous people, as opposed to someone else telling the story. So when I saw Smoke Stick, that was being based on Sherman Alexi's work, he's telling the story, and he made sure that he had a lot of control over what was projected on the screen. Yes, please.
I have a couple of questions about spiritual knowledge. I have a friend who was requested by the Lakota elders to collect their star knowledge, which he did 40 years ago. And Yale published it, and they asked permission to publish it widely, and the elders said no, because they were deeply concerned about misappropriation. Are the different nations talking together and sharing spiritual knowledge? And what about appropriation?
That's a very good question. Do we share information and ceremony with one another? Yes, that does happen. But it's also important to remember that we are all unique communities, so someone else's spiritual beliefs are not the same as ours. So there's kind of, it's more of a comparison of beliefs that happens when Indigenous people share their spiritual stories with each other. And it would be seen as a violation as an Indigenous community to share someone else's spiritual stories. That's not our place to do that for one another. And so out of respect, if someone shares that their spiritual beliefs and ceremony with you, that was a gift they shared with you, and you can hold that, but you shouldn't share that with other people. So yes, it does happen within Indigenous communities, but again, the rights to that knowledge, to that understanding, always has to remain with the community it comes from. And that's because even when other Native people share on behalf of other communities, we can get it wrong. That's not our community. And we may share things that the community doesn't want shared publicly. There are certain ceremonies and spiritual beliefs that, without a full understanding of the history, the culture, the community, may not make sense to others outside of that. And so there has to be care and consideration in what you share and how you share it, which I believe is why the Lakota elders grateful for those who have the ability to record and collect knowledge, but sometimes we just want to hold that knowledge for us so that our future generations will have that. And so it's when we do these things collaboratively, always understanding that information is the property of the community and not the collector, and being careful about those contracts, because that's what often happens, is those contracts. How many of us sign contracts without really looking at every detail, every time you sign into Netflix and it makes you click a thing to get to your movie, and we're just saying yes. And this happens with Indigenous communities. You put a bunch of paperwork in front of somebody, they don't really understand what they're signing, what they're reading through, and often we have signed away our rights to our own intellectual knowledge. And that's wrong. That's extremely wrong. So I think there needs to be concerted efforts to protect Indigenous ownership to their own knowledge and to have the ability to say when and where and how to share things. And that goes for other Indigenous people as well.
Thank you. Are there any questions online? I'm looking to see. Not yet. Okay. Any other questions in the room? Yes, if you could come to the mic, that would be great.
Thank you so much. I got a lot out of what you just spoke about. I learned a lot. I wanted to find out, I did some work in Canada for a university called Brock University. And they do a lot of work around the reconciliation document that Canadian government, I believe, in collaboration with a lot of the First Nationers, produced this document of reconciliation. I know that Ireland has done some work, some truth and reconciliation projects. South Africa, truth and reconciliation. So what do we here in the United States, you see what I'm getting at, right? Why haven't we done that, right? Why haven't we been able to tell the truth about what we've done in our history? And what is it going to take for us to do that? Number one. I'm sorry, Dottie, I have one more though.
Oh, no.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to. I'd like to know the role of food in preserving language. And thank you.
Yeah, good questions. I love that you threw in the food one. Why isn't United States doing the work? Nobody knows. Nobody knows why. Maybe we know. You know, that's such a frustrating thing, because I think what makes historical trauma still so very poignant in the lives of Indigenous people is the fact that there is no opportunity for addressing and acknowledging those hurts, acknowledging all of the relationship of conquest, colonization, land dispossession, the destruction of our community, the taking of our children. All of these things are hugely traumatic to a community. And yet, without an acknowledgement of those wrongs, people are internalizing all of the results of that hurt. And it makes it our fault. And for generations, we have seen images of it being our fault and our lacking. In media, the way that they have portrayed Indigenous people for generations, in terms that we grow up hearing, like Indian giver, all of these kind of things that speak to us as the problematic ones. And there's never an opportunity to have those hard discussions in the United States. They have not been welcomed. They have not been addressed. So I think if we're ever going to get to a point of actually healing communities, we need to have those conversations. So I think the door is open, but before any kind of healing and reclamation and all of that happens, there has to be, an admission of guilt. And the United States is not ready for that admission of guilt. And I think because there's responsibility that comes with that admission of guilt. And now you have to, once you admit it, what are you going to do to address it? And so far they've been getting away with the bare minimum, and they'd like to keep the status quo. So I think that's why we're still at the point we're at now. But better talking of food. Food is my favorite. Food does reconnect us to language. And I think right now we're seeing within Native communities a celebration of Indigenous foodways. The Indigenous food sovereignty movement is reclaiming traditional foodways to heal our spirits, our bodies, our connection with land, our connections with ancestors. So it's bringing back an understanding of language around food, what we call things, the names of things, because a lot of our foodways, particularly in the New England area, have been co-opted. They've been colonized. When we think of New England cuisine, those old foodways are all rooted in Indigenous recipes. And so it's decolonizing those terms like Indian pudding and Johnny cakes and all of that, and bringing back traditional names for those foods and a reclaiming of where those foods came from. And when we decolonize food, we also improve our health, because normally we're removing the fats and butters and pork fats and sugars and all of those things that, you know, we love and enjoy and taste good, but aren't necessarily best for our bodies. So we're doing a healing in decolonizing those foods physically as well. So I think we're in an exciting place around food, and it's being celebrated, and there are Indigenous chefs out there that are building businesses for themselves so that you can go and enjoy those cuisines as well. So I think we're all gonna get fat enjoying all of this celebration of food.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I have a question from the chat.
Okay, thank you.
Language is such a rich and beautiful expression of culture and perspective. It's fascinating to think how words and expressions that have no direct English language translation and how that might show a lack of understanding about any given word or topic. Can you talk about that a bit, or perhaps give an example?
Give an example of where language doesn't connect.
Yes.
I don't know if I have an example readily available in my head, or that could even be expressed, because that's the very nature of things not being translatable. So I guess I'll go with something else, because I thought this was a really powerful example of how when you break down meaning of a word, it tells us so much more in that history of that word. So it's fall. This is the season of all things wonderful in our harvest time, and squash is on the menu. And squash is an Indigenous word in our language, Narragansett language. It's askuta squash. So if you're saying squash, you are speaking in Algonquin. And my relative, Sharente, did a little video on this, speaking our native languages, where he broke down the meaning of the word askuta squash. And when you look at the traditional shape of squashes that were grown in our gardens, they had a long snake-like neck. So he was talking about askuta coming from askug, the snake. It can also come from the word askaski, which means green, talking about the green of the squash. And when we think of words like pumpkin, a lot of those kind of words, people like to claim where these things came from, and whether they were introduced. The language takes its roots from Latin or from French or from English, and oftentimes we forget, nope, it came right from Indigenous languages here. And even even amongst Indigenous communities, I have heard communities from westward and Ojibwe communities talking about the origins of words coming from there, and I was like, yep, a lot of similarities because we share an Algonquin language family. However, they met us first, and we introduced them to these things. So if we're talking about where they first learned these words, this is where the origins of these words are coming from. So I think it's not that people are trying to take ownership over language, but recognition around the history that connected people with these resources and with these words that we now use. So I think that's where, when we start to really look at language and meaning of language, we can make historical connections, we can make cultural connections, we can make community connections when we really think about meanings of words and what it means to a community and what it means to a people and how they interacted with it. So that's all I can think of. That's a good question. I would have needed more to actually answer your question, so I just answered it how I wanted to.
Oh, that's great. That's about self-determination right there.
Okay, this is a big question. I know we don't have much time, but do what you can. I recently went to Jack's Pond on a hike to see a place where there's a marker for the Black Heritage Trail that goes back to the 1700s when a Black person lived on that land. But being there really reminded me of the question of how these huge organizations control, nonprofits, conservation organizations control vast swaths of New Hampshire and also, I'm sure, Massachusetts, Maine, and other places. And we've talked a lot about collaboration and stewardship and not collaboration and stewardship when it comes to the Indigenous community. I'm wondering, I never hear about those organizations, the Nature Conservancy, all those kinds of, the Sierra Club, specifically working with the Indigenous community. They're certainly trying now to work with the Black community in various ways, mostly around the use of the land for recreation. But what's happening, if anything, about making the land accessible or restoring the land, educating them about the history of the land, so forth?
That is happening. Conversations, at least. I have done work with the Nature Conservancy within our region. I serve in conservation spaces. I serve on the town, for my town's conservation commission. Because for Indigenous people, conservation is about having access to land, to continue cultural practice. And that's not always the way non-Native people look at conservation. There's a means of wanting to protect the land, to keep it how it is. And we're like, you're supposed to engage with the land. You're supposed to have relationship with it. And I think there's value in building relationships because when you're connected to something, when it's important to you, when it's an everyday part of your life, when you utilize it, it makes you want to make sure those resources stay available. So you work twice as hard to protect them and to preserve them and to reintroduce things. So a lot of conservation efforts are around let's just clean it up and leave it how it is. We're like, nope, we should be putting things back that were originally there. There's a tribal elder who spoke about our forests being food forests, and these were well-groomed spaces that were managed and maintained to provide. And so we don't just leave it alone. We give back, we reproduce, we protect, and we put back. And that should be a part of conservation efforts. So I think what happens around a lot of these conversations is those disagreements around use of those spaces and how we're allowed to interact with them. And I think Indigenous people have made it very clear what our goal would be, which is land back. In 2020, the Land Back Manifesto was officially incorporated, and it speaks to returning land, particularly these open spaces, these public space lands that we're not taking a home from anybody, we're not pushing someone off of that space. But why not return those lands to tribal communities to manage and maintain and allow them to engage with it? Thank you. Because for non-Native people, your identity isn't connected to having access to those spaces. For us, it is. And we see the results of not having access to those spaces. I live in Rhode Island. I'm a Narragansett tribal member. Our traditional homelands were most of the state of Rhode Island, and now we are relegated to 1,800 acres in Charlestown, Rhode Island, and none of it is coastal land. So imagine nature doing what it does not everything you need access to continue your cultural way of life is in that 1,800 acres. That's just not the way land forms. That's not the way things grow. We literally know that certain regions of land and how they were produced, glacial movements of land and how waters were formed and ecology systems, all of that created places where that's where all of your hickories grow. And this is where all of your cattails are gonna be. And down here is where you're gonna find the salt ponds. So we need access to all of those spaces in order to be able to continue all of those cultural practices. And as it stands now, we have generationally found more and more difficulty in passing on those traditions to future generations because of lack of access to land. I can't just take a group of tribal youth to any space that I want to in Rhode Island and reintroduce them to the practices that would have traditionally happened in those spaces. A lot of these spaces are privately owned. Those spaces that are state-owned land, they define how you can interact with them. We have to get permissions in certain spaces. And for things that were called like ceremonial, there is a cleansing and blessing of a space in order to use it spiritually, and a protection and monitoring of that in order to maintain that sacred space. You can't do that if you don't own that land. So that's why land back is so important to tribal communities. And it's even more so than the return of land. It's also the ability to govern the land that we have, to actually have sovereignty over that land, because it then just becomes words if we don't actually have the power to enforce any protections within our space, particularly against non-native people who can come onto your lands, commit crime, do hurtful and harmful things, and you can't hold them responsible. So there's a multitude of factors that need to be in place, and I feel like you could solve them all if you just give us the land back.
So please join me in thanking.
To Bnec, thank you.
Thank you very much.